Rolling.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and it's a great pleasure. My name is James Alcock. I've come all the way from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, which is right there. And it's a great pleasure to be here in the UK, in Scotland, and to talk to UAS. I've been supporting you since long before the referendum, and it's great to be here. It's great to talk to you, and thank you so very much for giving me this opportunity. But I'm going to talk to you today about, we've been through the same situation you're going through, with us with Quebec. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to do this in two parts. The first part, I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical background that led up to the separatists getting into power. And I'm going to give you, it's going to seem like you're back in school. I'm going to give you a little bit of a history lesson, just to give you the background information. And then we'll have a little break, and then after that I think we'll get into the actual meat of the referendum and all the dirty tricks the nationalists pulled, and how separatists we call them, and how we how we dealt with it. So I'm going to take you back to the year 1759 to begin with. And originally Quebec belonged to France. It was a French colony. It had been colonized in the early 1600s. And the American eastern seaboard of the United States was English, and Newfoundland was originally English as well. Nova Scotia, right here, which means New Scotland, was originally a Scottish colony from before the union with England, and then the French got it, but then after the union, Britain got it back. And so in 1759, you had the British down in the American colonies, Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, and then Quebec and all sort of central Canada belonged to France. And then all the west, of course, hadn't been settled yet. But the British also had trading in the Hudson's Bay area. This is Hudson's Bay up here. All up in here was also British as well, because it was held by the Hudson's Bay Company, which is a trading company. So the American colonies felt threatened by these French colony in Quebec, and they always dealt with, there were always wars going on between the two, and they felt that there was always going to be a threat to the American colonies. So the 7 Years' War between 1756 and 1763, the British conquered Quebec. Okay, a troop of 9,000 British troops marched into Quebec against 4,000 French troops. The battle lasted 20 minutes. The British opened fire, the French just turned tail and ran. And the great part about it was that the scout was a Scotsman. The Scottish Highlanders actually made up a large part of those British troops. And one of them, who was a Scotsman who spoke perfect French, was actually able to fool the French into thinking that they were the supply ships for them. In actual fact, it was British troops. And he also found a way up the cliffs to the Plains of Abraham. And in a 20-minute battle, the British, Quebec was in British hands. And then the British threat the French threat to the British colonies was removed. But the one thing that the British did when they conquered Quebec was they said, you will keep your language, you will keep your way of life, you will keep your culture, your Catholic Church, everything. And we will just administer it. We won't touch your way of life, we'll leave it intact. And that secured their loyalty. And then, of course, that war had to be paid for, so and it was the American colonists that had insisted on it, so the taxes came along from Britain on the American colonies to pay for that war, and of course then we all know what that led to. And also the Americans wanted to keep slavery, which we didn't support, which we opposed, we didn't support that. So it led to the American War of Independence. Now at that time, the Americans, when they had the revolution, asked Canada to join them. But we said no, no thank you. The French in Quebec and the natives had said, The British have guaranteed our language rights, and they've kept them. So we trust them, so we're sticking with Britain. And we don't trust the Americans. We think they'll make us speak English. And Nova Scotia and Newfoundland had a very strong trade with Britain, so they said we don't want to jeopardize that. So the Canadian, well, everybody goes on about how the Americans rose up and declared independence. What they don't realize is that Canadians were the no voters. They said, no, we're sticking with Britain. We trust them. So the border was put down the middle of North America, and 2 countries were created. One independent, one loyal to Britain. And that's basically how the division happened. So moving forward, just going to take you through time very quickly. Again, in Quebec, and then what happened after the American Revolution was a lot of American colonists who were loyal to Britain came up into what's now Ontario, this province right here, which is where I come from, and settled in there. And that became a predominantly English-speaking province, settled by what they call the United Empire Loyalists. About 1/3 of the American colonists, they moved into Ontario and settled here to remain loyal to Britain. And also we got a lot of English settlers, a lot of Scottish settlers. I mean, you look at the towns in Ontario, you think you were back here. And we've got Perth, we've got Hamilton, we've got New Dundee, and London, and Windsor, and I live in Scarborough, next one's Pickering, then Whitby. I mean, you'd think you were back in the UK. And all the counties are Northumberland and Glengarry, but they're all, the English and Scottish ones are all mixed together because they all settled together. And then in 1812, the Americans tried to invade Canada when Britain was at war with Napoleon, and they were beaten, they were driven out. The Americans occupied Toronto and burned it to the ground, so we repaid the compliment by burning down Washington, D.C. And again, French Canadians in Quebec remained loyal to Britain because their language had been protected. Okay? And the fact is, in Quebec, even the British governor in Quebec, all his staff had to speak French as well, so that the settlers there were not forced to speak English. They could continue to speak French, but a lot of them learned English as well. They were basically left to just carry on their lives while the British administered. Then in 1837, the Americans decided, well, we can't conquer Canada, so let's try it a different way. Let's cause some trouble in Quebec. Let's stir up Quebec against the British. And so an American named Robert Nelson came into Montreal in 1837, and he started preaching about, well, you know, you were conquered by the British, and you're French Canadians, and you know, really, you know, if you go independent, then maybe you can, you know, you won't have this British, be under British control. So he set himself up as the president of Quebec, declared it an independent country, called they declared UDI. This was 1837. Unilateral Declaration of Independence. He set himself up as the president of Quebec. The whole plan was to make it into an American protectorate so that it could eventually be annexed into the USA. Problem is, it lasted 2 days. The French Canadians didn't trust him. British troops removed him within 2 days. So that died. A lot of people don't know that. So moving forward in time, again, I'm just running through this quickly just to give you an idea of it. We come to the 1860s. Now that's when something very important happened. By then, we had a British colony in British Columbia, we had settlements in Ontario, settled in Quebec, settled in the maritime provinces. By the way, Nova Scotia is settled by the people who were cleared out of Scotland during the Highland clearances. And their descendants today are still living there. And my boss actually at work is one of their descendants. And they have no problem with Britain. They're very loyal. So anyway, what happened was we had all these loose British colonies across North America, but they were always scared of an American invasion. So a Scotsman named John A. Macdonald decided, why don't we unite all this into one country, make it strong, and it can be loyal to the British Empire and resist American invasion. So he went to Queen Victoria, and he decided to, and he consulted with the other premiers of the provinces, or colonies as they were then, and they put together a proposal, and it was approved by the British Parliament. And on July 1st, 1867, the provinces, the colonies, united into a single dominion known as the Dominion of Canada, with its capital at Ottawa. Now, it was not an independent country. It was still a British colony, but it was a federal, united colony, one. So that way, it could better resist American invasion if it was united together. And again, one of the things that they put when the British North America Act was passed by the British Parliament, that was the act that set up the Dominion, the one thing that it stated was that Quebec's French-speaking rights would be protected in Quebec, that Quebec would be bilingual, English and French. Everything would be provided in both English and French, and it would be guaranteed. It was written right into the British North America Act, okay? And that's the act that the Westminster passed to set up the Dominion. And Johnny MacDonald, who, by the way, was born right here in Glasgow, he was knighted, became Sir Johnny MacDonald, and became the Dominion's first Prime Minister. And he's featured on our $10 note. I will show you that afterwards. I brought some Canadian money. But the Constitution of Canada, the British North America Act, remained under the control of Westminster. So only Westminster could pass amendments to it because it was a British Act. And again, as I said, Quebec's language rights and its distinct culture were protected in it. So again, we'll move forward, and we had British Canadian soldiers and sailors served in the Boer War and in the First World War. Now, when we got to the First World War, 1914 to 1918. By the way, we were there from the start, unlike the Americans. Well, we did we followed the mother country. 1917 is when the very first Quebec, rest of Canada split began. And that was over what they call the conscription crisis of 1917. English-speaking Canadians. Now, when I say English Canadians, I don't mean England English, I mean English-speaking. That includes Scots, okay? Were proud imperialists. Whatever the mother country needs, we're there. Britain needs troops to fight in the trenches, we're off. We're there, we're ready to fight. Quebecers weren't so enthusiastic about it. Their attitude was, well, it's Europe's war, it's Britain's war, it's over there, it really doesn't concern us. Do we really have to do this? And in 1917, there was the government proposed bringing in conscription. Now, you know what that is, where, drafting young people. And there was a massive split between French-speaking Canadians who said no, and English-speaking Canadians who said yes. And at that time, the attitude between Quebec and the rest of Canada was Quebec was French-speaking and more Canadian nationalists, wanting a more independent Canada, was Anglo-speaking Canadians were staunch imperialists and wanted to do whatever the British Empire wanted. That's where my family fits in. And anyway, so, we flew the Union Jack, we were very proud to be British, but a sense of national identity was beginning to grow, but it was more in Quebec than it was in the rest of the country. So the government did not introduce conscription. They dropped the issue, and all of our troops in the First World War were volunteers. And some Quebecers did go. The Vendeurs Regiment from Quebec went over, and and they fought really well. Now, to move forward, after the First World War, in 1931, the government passed what's called the Statute of Westminster. Now, the British government passed the Statute of Westminster. Now, what that did was it gave full autonomy, devolved powers, we've heard that before, haven't we, to the British Dominions, to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and at that time, Newfoundland, which had refused to become part of Canada. It actually stayed a separate dominion. And granted them full autonomy, but their constitutions, which had been British acts, remained the property of the United Kingdom government. So from that point on, in 1931, we could, whenever Britain went to war, Canada did not have to go to war anymore. It would be our own choice. And no British law applied to us unless without our consent. So in other words, British laws could still apply to Canada and the other dominions, but only with our consent. And they started imperial conferences, so all the prime ministers of the dominions started to talk, and the idea of it becoming a commonwealth of nations began to sort of take root. But the constitutions remained the property of Westminster, and the good thing about that was it was a third party that controlled the constitution. It wasn't controlled by Canada, so therefore, Westminster was this third party, which was good, so it could be more neutral. And only all Westminster did was say, whatever you want an amendment, just let us know, we pass it, it's done, no debate. And anyway, but we also continued to be British subjects. We continued to be a firm part of the British Empire, but it was devolved. Power was devolved now amongst all the dominions. So when the Second World War came along, the dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Newfoundland, did not have to go to war if Britain went to war. We did it because we wanted to stand by the mother country out of pure loyalty. September the 3rd, 1939, Great Britain went to war. All the dominions joined in as well, except Ireland, of course, they didn't. Newfoundland had gone broke in the 1930s because of the Depression, so it went back to being a colony. But after the Second World War, now I'm going to talk about referendum. After the Second World War in 1949, a referendum was held in Newfoundland about joining Canada. Britain said, okay, you've got three choices. You can join Canada, remain a colony, or become independent as a separate dominion. Three choices on their referendum in Newfoundland. And so they voted, and the vote was split 3 ways. And Britain said, you know what, that's not good. Well, no, that's no good. It's too close, not enough people voted. 3 choices is too confusing, so we're dismissing that referendum. We'll give you a second one. And the second one, you only had 2 choices, independent dominion or join Canada. Newfoundland joined Canada by 51%. Became our 10th province, which now completed the whole country. And after the Second World War, that's when the empire was now, because after the independence of India in 1947, that's when the British Empire was now turning into the Commonwealth of Nations. And Canadian citizenship was introduced in 1947. And just to let you know, I brought some flags along. I want to show you what they stand for. I'll talk to about those in a few minutes. And the appeals to the House of Lords were abolished, and all the dominions of the British Commonwealth were now starting to be treated as nations rather than as subordinate to Britain. They were now being treated as equal nations in the Commonwealth. So in 1947, we became Canadian citizens. Up to that point, we'd only been British subjects, but we became Canadian citizens. Canadian citizenship was introduced, but we were British subjects as well. We had the 2, and and a Canadian was appointed as Governor General instead of a British Governor General. Up to that point, we'd always had a British Governor General. Now we had a Canadian one, and the debate was on to replace the Union Jack with a more Canadian type flag, though English Canadians wanted the Union Jack in the corner. French Canadians didn't. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But after World War II, that was when things began to really change. Up to that point, as I said to you, French Canadians in Quebec, their language had been protected, but they were Canadian nationalists, and English-speaking Canadians were British imperialists. Nothing to be ashamed of in that. They were proud of being part of an empire they were part of, that they'd fought for. But after World War II, as the independence of India and the empire was turning into the Commonwealth, at that point, English-speaking Canadians were now turning into Canadians, and Quebecers, French-speaking Canadians, were turning into Quebec nationalists. So the opinion was shifting. And what I want to show you, just to take a few minutes, I want to show you a few flags that just out of interest. This was Canada's flag at that time. It was what they call the Canadian Red Ensign. And if you take a look at the badge, can you see England, Scotland, Ireland, and France, and the maple leaves on the bottom? It shows the contribution of the English, the Scots, and the Irish. British unity helped to build the country. And Union Jack in the corner to show our loyalty to the British Empire. Then in 1957, they changed the green maple leaves on the bottom to red maple leaves, because everybody liked autumn colors. You know, if you look at the trees, they change colors. Everybody likes the nice, beautiful golden autumn colors. So the little maple leaves on the bottom got changed from green to red, because everybody likes autumn colors. So, okay, it's fine. Now, Quebec, until 1948, this was Quebec's flag. Now, if you take a look at that, you see the three fleurs-de-lis, which represents Quebec's French origin, and underneath you see the English lion for the English-speaking Quebecers who live in Montreal, and then the little three maple leaves on the bottom representing, you know, them being part of Canada. Now, at that time, about 18% of Quebec was English-speaking. And they lived predominantly in the Montreal area, which is right about here. There were a few French Canadians in other parts, like in northern Ontario and in northern New Brunswick. But in Quebec, and mostly Montreal, there was a large English-speaking population, and most of them were bankers, business operators, manufacturers, and they often hired the French-speaking Canadians. And most of the French-speaking Canadians were farmers. Now, the northern part of Quebec was mostly native people. Now, the difference is in America, you know, they had wars and took their land, but in Canada they didn't. In Canada, the native tribes made a treaty with the Crown, directly with the Crown. The Crown, so all the native land is Crown land. Okay? And I want to tell you something. I live very near to a native reserve, you know, down in southwestern Ontario, settled by the Iroquois, who were fantastic fighters. And they fought for the British during the American Revolution. So to thank them for that, the king at that time granted the natives tax-free status forever. And to this, they said, oh, they taxed the colonies, but then gave no tax to the natives to thank them for serving Britain. To this very day, you go on the native reserve, there's no tax. I can go on the native reserve and buy my petrol. A lot cheaper with no tax on it. I can go in I'm a white person who can go on the native reserve. I can't buy land there, but I can visit and I can eat all my food, go in the restaurants, no tax. To this very day, and that's forever. As long as Canada remains under the Crown, the natives will be tax-free. And that was done, the Crown gave them that in the 1780s to thank them for serving Britain during the American Revolution. And the good thing about it, all of the northern part of Quebec and parts of northern Ontario are Crown land. Is Crown land belonging to the natives that are there. So when the separatists came along later, that played an important role. I also want to mention there's very big hydroelectric projects up there in northern Quebec. Huge, what they call the James Bay Hydroelectric Project. James Bay is right here. And it's it's a multi-million-dollar hydroelectric project. It's right in native land. So that also played out in the separatist referendum later on. But anyway, and in Ontario, the same thing, the province where I live, there's quite a few native reserves. And there's been a big issue lately, people buying illegal tax-free cigarettes on the native reserve. We're not supposed to do that, but people do it anyway. So anyhow, so after World War II, what happened was, we're going to take a break in a few minutes. There's one other thing I want to show you just out of interest, is the flag of the province of Nova Scotia. Right here, there it is. It's the saltire in reverse with the rampant lion in the middle, because it means New Scotland. So here it is. I thought you might like that one. And they are, as I said, settled by the descendants from the Highland clearances. And to this very day, they're very loyal to the Crown. They have nothing against English people. We have never had an English-Scottish rivalry in Canada, but we've always had these English-speaking and French rivalry. And so that's the flag of Nova Scotia. I brought that because I thought, you know, guys being Scots might be interested to see that. And the province where I live, in Ontario, I've got our flag too, but I'm going to talk about that later. Right now, I want to start getting into the post-World War II era, because that's when things began to really change. You know, with the decline, with the turning of the I don't like to say decline of the British Empire, I don't like that. The changing of the British Empire to the Commonwealth, that's better. And at that point, with the independence of India, and with the granting of, you know, we became Canadian citizens, and you know, we're becoming more independent. And at that time, the Canadian Constitution was still under the control of Westminster. And the Canadian government says, we'd like to bring it, to transfer it to Canada, but we can't agree on an amending formula. So how are we going to, you know, so we turned around to Westminster and we said, you keep it until we can agree on an amending formula. Because you're a third party. You know, I mean, these people here, these gnats here complain about Westminster, but actually Westminster was a godsend for us, because they were the third party that kept control of our that basically just had the guardianship. And it was a British act. So therefore, they had the guardianship of it. And whenever Canada requested an amendment, they just passed it. They didn't even question it. There was no problem. And after World War II now, we were now a fully sovereign nation, except for the Constitution being under the British North America Act being under the control of Westminster. And of course, we were still loyal to the Crown. And then in 1952, the last British Governor General went home, and we were replaced with a Canadian Governor General. And you know, and the appeals to the House of Lords was abolished, and the Supreme Court of Canada became the highest court in the land. And you know, they started doing the sort of last little things to make us look more like an independent country, but still within the Commonwealth and still under the Crown. And the Union Jack was still our flag. The red ensign was basically only used internationally to recognize us to recognize Canada. In Canada, we flew the Union Jack. We were British right through to the core. I've got old pictures of Toronto in the 50s just covered in Union Jacks. Oh, it was lovely. And anyway, then in 1946 they said, well, you know, it's time for a Canadian flag. So people in English-speaking Canada said, it's got to have the Union Jack in it. Got it. Quebecers said, no, we want that out. We want a separate flag. So there was so much disagreement over that, the issue was dropped. They just said, oh, you know what, forget it, just leave it. And so it continued as it was before. But anyway, and after World War II then, the European countries now were starting to decolonize around the world. You had the independence of India, you had the independence of the African countries. And that's when the nationalist feeling in Quebec began to rise. And what they began to say is, we were conquered by the British in 1763, 1759, 1763. The British conquered us, so therefore we were colonized by the British. And Canada is a manifestation of the British Empire. It was created by the British Empire. Its constitution is controlled by London. So therefore, the only way we can be a French-speaking state and to protect our language in this English-speaking continent is to go independent. So it was kind of this insecurity of this French enclave in an English-speaking continent that began to make the Quebecers feel now it's time to go that they wanted to go independent. And also they thought, most English-speaking Canadians saw Canada as a sovereign state in the British Commonwealth of Nations. And by the way, in 1952, up till 1952, the British monarch was King of Great Britain and Ireland and the British dominions beyond the seas. But when Queen Elizabeth came to the throne, she adopted distinctive titles: Queen of Canada, Queen of Australia, Queen of New Zealand, in addition to being Queen of the United Kingdom. And so English-speaking Canadians were okay with it because they said we are a sovereign state in the British Commonwealth. But French-speaking Canadians saw that as a manifestation of the British Empire. And they said that the world is decolonizing. We were conquered, so the only way we're going to, and we're surrounded by, we're a French enclave in an English-speaking continent, the only way that we're going to be able to permanently protect our French language and our French way of life is to secede from Canada and become an independent state. And that and disagreements over the flag and disagreements over the Constitution and things like that only fed into it. So in 1957, the separatist movement in Quebec was founded, and it was called the RNI, Rassemblement National de l'Indépendance, something in French anyway. But basically what it meant the Assembly for National Independence. And it was founded, it wasn't a political party. It was just it was a grassroots movement, okay, of people in Quebec, and what they felt was that Canada was basically a manifestation of the British Empire. Quebec, they wanted, and that the world is decolonizing, people who are conquered are becoming free, so therefore it's time for Quebec to do the same thing, and they founded the movement in 1957. And up to that point, Quebec had been governed by a political party called the Union Nationale. Okay, all the parties in Quebec have French names. I will translate them. The political parties in Canada, across the country, in the federal government. Now, you must also remember one thing: the difference between the UK and Canada. Canada is a federation. It's not a unitary state like the UK. The UK is a unitary state with devolved powers to Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. Canada is a federation. The provinces, each one, there's 10 of them now, is a sovereign government. And the Constitution clearly divides powers between the federal government, which we used to call the Dominion government, now it's called federal government in Ottawa. Their responsibilities are theirs, and the responsibilities of each of the provinces are theirs, and there's no overlapping. So whatever the provinces have control over, the feds can't touch it, okay? So it's not like it can be appealed to the federal government and they can overrule it. It doesn't work like that. The Constitution clearly divides the powers so that in Quebec and in the rest of the country, there are certain responsibilities. For example, healthcare and roads and language policy are provincial jurisdictions. Federal government has no say in it. National defense, international affairs, and language policy at the federal level, which is different from the provincial level, are federal jurisdictions. Now, up till that point, until the rise of the Quebec separatist movement, Canada was officially an English-speaking country with English and French both enshrined in law for Quebec. And in Quebec, everything had to be bilingual. Everything, all the laws, because don't forget, 18% of the province was English-speaking. And so all the laws had to be in both languages, but only the federal government did everything in both languages. Quebec did everything in both languages. All the rest of the provinces was English only. Ontario was English only, where I live. And then what happens, as I said, in 1957, they said the world is decolonizing. It's time for Quebec nationalists began to think they should do the same thing. And what they did was the grassroots movement called the RNI. Now, what I'm going to have to do is, through my note, I'm going to have to refer to my notes. And And basically what they had this sense of, Quebecers had this, the Quebec nationalists had this sense of being conquered. Okay, it's not like Scotland and England where it was a union. In Quebec, it was conquered by the British. So somehow that gave them this inferiority complex. This feel, you know, the English-speaking people are the conquerors, we are the conquered. Never mind the fact that they've left us to speak our own language and run our own, you know, basically run our own affairs. They still had this sense that they had to go all the way to full independence in order to protect their way of life with absolutely no threat in the English-speaking continent. So in 1957, like I said, it was the separatist movement was formed, and basically at that point, they wanted to get rid of the imperial symbols in Canada. You know, they wanted you know, they pushed hard for a new flag to get the Union Jack out of it. And they also pushed hard for you know, priority of French over English. You know, and sort of starting with little things like that and just gradually moving towards the sovereign state. And so, but the actual political party, the Parti Québécois, wasn't formed until 11 years later, until 1968. So what I want to do now is let's take a break. It's all getting kind of hot in here. Let's take a break for about 10-15 minutes, maybe 15 minutes. And after that, I'm going to come back and then we'll start moving into talking about the Quebec separatists, the rise of the separatist party, the referenda, and then we'll go from there and then we'll have some questions after. So let's have a break.